We're approaching the one-year commemoration of the events in Gaza between December 27th and January 18th. And I thought I would use this occasion to review what the record shows on what actually happened in Gaza. There's a lot of material came out in the past year, both in the form of human rights reports and also in the form of various testimonies, mostly by Israeli soldiers, but also other testimonies in the course of the Goldstone mission's reportage on Gaza. So I wanted to first look at what happened in Gaza, because I'm afraid the history is going to be rapidly rewritten. In fact, it's already being rewritten. And then secondly, look at the Goldstone report, which seems to be the major repercussion of the Gaza events, and to try to figure out what is the significance of the report. And since this is mostly an activist audience, what we can learn from the Goldstone report in terms of how we should proceed in the future on trying to resolve the conflict. So let me begin by going through what happened in Gaza. For those of you who have clear memories, you'll forgive me for going over old ground. And for those of you whose memories are clouded, I think it's useful to try to recall the sequence of events. In January 2006, there were elections, parliamentary elections held in the occupied territories. Hamas won the elections in what Jimmy Carter called completely honest and fair, a completely honest and fair election. The immediate reaction of the United States and Israel was to impose economic sanctions on Hamas. In 2007, the United States, or in June 2007, the United States, Israel, and elements of the Palestinian Authority attempted a coup against the elected government in Gaza. The coup was foiled by the Hamas leadership, and the Palestinian Authority elements were forced to retreat into the West Bank. When the coup was foiled by Hamas, the immediate reaction of the United States and Israel was to tighten the blockade on Gaza, which Amnesty International called a flagrant violation of international law. Richard Goldstone, in the report under his name, he called the blockade a possible crime against humanity. At the time of the blockade, or even before the blockade was tightened, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, she journeyed to Gaza, and she said at the time that Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. In June 2008, Hamas and Israel entered into a ceasefire, and there was a quid pro quo in the ceasefire. On the Palestinian side, they were supposed to cease rocket attacks against Israel, and the Israeli side, they were supposed to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. The Palestinians, as far as one can tell, honored their side of the ceasefire. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a publication in which they wrote that Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. On the other side, Israel did not fulfill its obligation to gradually lift the economic blockade of Gaza. In November 2008, Israel was now ready to launch its attack on Gaza, an attack which it had planned at least from 2007, March 2007. It needed a pretext. It didn't have at that point a pretext. And so on November 4th, 2008, as the results of the US presidential election were coming in and all of the media were riveted to the results of those elections, Israel launched a deadly raid into Gaza, in effect ending the ceasefire. Amnesty International, in its annual report for 2008, it wrote, "A ceasefire agreed in June between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza held for 4.5 months, but broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on 4 November 2008. Even though the ceasefire broke down, Hamas until the last week in December expressed a willingness to renew the ceasefire insofar as Israel was willing to lift that blockade of Gaza, the blockade which was a flagrant violation of international law, which was destroying a civilization. Sarah Roy, the Harvard-trained economist, she wrote in December, just on the eve of the Israeli attack, she said, "The breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us, but there is little international response beyond UN warnings which are ignored." Hamas, as I said, expressed a willingness to renew the ceasefire and in fact to even expand the terms of the ceasefire. Israel refused. It demanded an unconditional and unilateral Hamas cessation of rocket fire. And then when Hamas refused those terms, the unconditional and unilateral ceasefire, Israel attacked on December 27th. I would mention in passing that some people are fairly quick to criticize Hamas for refusing to cease the rocket attacks, and the criticism is made both on moral legal grounds and also on tactical grounds. The moral legal grounds are that the Hamas rocket attacks were illegal under international law because they either targeted civilians or they were indiscriminate attacks on Israel. And then the tactical criticism of Hamas is that it gave Israel the pretext it wanted to launch the attack. In my opinion, neither of those criticisms are valid. I don't think that the Palestinians had any obligation to lay down and die. I don't think any tenet of international law imposes that obligation on Palestinians. When you say that they shouldn't have fired the rockets on either moral legal grounds or on tactical grounds, you have to present an alternative. A civilization is being destroyed. A flagrant violation of international law has been imposed on the people of Gaza. Sarah Roy wrote, to quote her again, "The breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us." You have to present, in my opinion, an alternative. What else could Hamas have done under those circumstances? And unless you can present an alternative, another option, it doesn't seem to me that any criticism or that criticism of Hamas is valid. I would also want to point out, for what it's worth, because people often say, if the Palestinians only had a Gandhi. The problem with people who make that kind of claim is they have not a clue what Gandhi actually wrote on these subjects. Gandhi was very clear on the fact, as he put it, that there are certain kinds of violence when, if they're resorted to against an overwhelming force, in his view, they're not violence. So, for example, he gave the cases of a woman who resists a rapist with slaps and bites. Or he gave the example of the Polish in 1939, the Polish trying to resist the Nazi invasion of Poland. And in both cases, Gandhi said, whether it's a woman resorting to slaps and bites in order to fend off a rapist, or it's the Poles in 1939 resisting this overwhelming force, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe, with the pitiful Polish army. And I see a Polish friend in the back, one of my former students. Don't be offended. He said in both of those cases, in his view, it wasn't violence when the woman resorts to the slaps and bites, or the Polish army in the face of the Nazi invasion. He said because the quote-unquote violence, it's just purely symbolic. And he said all it really is it's a kind of fill-up in order to give you the courage to die with dignity. And anybody who compares the situations, it doesn't seem to me, or it does seem to me, that the Hamas rocket fire, to which I'll return in a few moments, the Hamas rocket fire fit within the category of the slaps and the bites or the Poles in 1939, which from Gandhi's point of view was not violence. In any case, what did happen in Gaza after the attack began in December 27th? Right now, the usual language is to refer to the Gaza war. Some people refer to it as the Gaza operation. And I think the first question to ask ourselves is, was it a war? Is that what happened in Gaza? After January 18th, the Israelis were very proud of themselves. They were walking around boasting about how they had put those Arabs in their place again. They showed who's in charge in the Middle East, that they had effaced the defeat that they suffered in 2006 in Lebanon, and that now the Arabs know who's in charge because they won that war in Gaza. But an Israeli strategic analyst writing in Israel's main newspaper, most respected newspaper, Haaretz, he said, "It is very dangerous for Israel to believe it won the war when there was no war. In reality, not a single battle was fought during the 22 days of fighting. This was not a war. It was not even a real battle." What happened on the ground? Well, it began with, the first week was what they called the air phase of the attack. And the course of the full 22 days, Israel flew about 3,000 sorties, attacks by air on Gaza. Every plane returned, none was downed, none was even hurt or damaged. And that's not surprising because the Palestinian resistance had no air defenses, no anti-aircraft defenses. The planes, to quote one military analyst, the planes operated in an environment free of air defense, enjoying complete aerial superiority. It took as much courage to fly planes over Gaza as it does to shoot fish in a barrel, or for those of you who frequent Coney Island as I do, it took as much courage as it does to shoot the freak. After the first week, Israel launched its air and ground offensive in Gaza. There were no battles. There couldn't have been any battles because Israel was using special night fighting equipment. Hamas couldn't even see them. And that's not just speculation. It's what all the soldiers said. Many soldiers after the Gaza events, they spoke out about their experiences in Gaza. So this is what they said. Soldier, there was nothing there. Ghost towns, except for some livestock, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were not really too many events. Soldier, I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there. Soldier, everyone was disappointed about not engaging anyone. Soldier, usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course, not a soul. Soldier, go ahead and ask soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing, no one. Soldier, there was supposed to be a tiny resistance force upon entry, but there just wasn't. There was no one. Now that comes from a publication called Breaking the Silence, a compendium of soldier testimonies after what happened in Gaza. And that's one side of the story. There was nobody there. There were no battles. There were no enemies in the field. But that's half, as I said. The other half gives you a full picture. And it's worth it for you to look at it for yourself. If you get home, to just enter under Google Breaking the Silence, and you bring up the document, and then you enter under the search function, enter the word insane. And if you enter the word insane, you'll see there are 7 times it appears in that document. Now the soldiers were interviewed separately, but they all kept saying the same thing, namely that Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Insane, insane, insane. No enemy in the field, no resistance, no battles, but Israel is resorting to insane amounts of firepower. One soldier said, "This was firepower such as I had never known before. There were blasts all the time. The earth was constantly shaking." Another soldier said, "On the ground you hear these thunderous blasts all day long. I mean, not just tank shelling, which was a tune we'd long gotten used to, but blasts that actually rock the outpost, to the extent that some of us were ordered out of the house we were quartered in for fear it would collapse. They were shooting and firing into the horizon, but the houses that they had commandeered in Gaza were shaking from their foundations, even though the firing was into the distance." So what happened in Gaza? Actually, some of the soldiers came up with quite illuminating metaphors. One said, "It felt like hunting season had begun. Sometimes it reminded me of a PlayStation computer game." Another said, "You feel like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ants." Now, I was a kid, I remember, and I used to take that magnifying glass, focus the rays of the sun, and incinerate ants in an anthill. And I can't say I'm proud of it, but I had, even at that age, enough lucidity of mind not to imagine I was engaged in a war. And that's what was happening in Gaza. It was like a child playing with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. About 13 to 1400 Palestinians were killed, up to as many as 4/5 were civilians. About 350 children were killed. The total, the estimates are 353 to 358. children were killed. Total Israeli casualties came to about 10 combatants killed. Not about, we know exactly. 10 combatants were killed. Half of those 10 were killed due to friendly fire, Israelis accidentally killing each other. And 3 civilians were killed. So it was a ratio of about 100 to 1. 100 Palestinians were killed for each Israeli killed. And on the civilians, it was about 400 Israeli civilians killed for every Palestinian that was killed. Excuse me. 400 Palestinians killed for every Israeli killed. Excuse me. I would want to just make a side comment there. There was much criticism of a lot of the human rights reports, including the Goldstone reports, which it was alleged they were disproportionate, the reports, in their allocation of space to criticism of Israel and criticism of the Palestinians. And in fact, they were disproportionate, but the disproportionality goes in the opposite direction than what was claimed against these reports. If you take the Goldstone report, to which I'll return presently, it devoted about 1/5, between about 1/10, I'm trying to estimate now. I would say it devoted about 10% of the report to what happened in Israel, and about 90% to what happened to Palestinians. So it's a ratio of about 9 to 1, roughly speaking. But if you look at the actual numbers, say for example, numbers killed, the ratio is about 400 to 1. Civilians killed, total killed about 100 to 1. Or you take something like damage done to infrastructure. About 6,000 Palestinian homes were ravaged during those days in Gaza. In the case of Israel, Amnesty International wrote that one house was almost completely destroyed. So the ratio was roughly about 6,000 to 1 when it came to houses. As I said, about 100 to 1 when it came to total casualties, 400 to 1 when it came to civilians. So if Goldstone devoted about 10% of his report to Israel, he gave it much more space than the objective data actually warranted. And that was true of all the reports. In the case of Human Rights Watch, time doesn't allow me to go into detail. Human Rights Watch put out 5 reports. Of those 5 reports, 2 of the 5, 40%, were devoted to criticizing the Palestinians. One because of the Palestinian attacks on Israel, and a second devoted to Hamas treatment of dissenters during the Gaza attack, basically attacks on Fatah people. So they gave over 40% of their total report coverage of the Gaza to criticism of Hamas. If you look at the proportion again, it's way over what the objective data would have warranted. Well, what happened apart from the killing? Many things were said about the attacks in Gaza. First of all, it was said that Hamas was using ambulances to ferry militants and weaponry. All the human rights reports investigate that claim. I should point out that probably no other occasion in the history of the conflict produced so many human rights reports as the case of the attack on Gaza. There were probably about 12 to 15 major reports that were put out. As I said, 5 by Human Rights Watch, 2 by Amnesty International, 2 major human rights missions, the Dugard mission and the Goldstone mission, Then there were reports by Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, several major reports by Palestinian human rights organizations. So it's been very extensively studied, and the reports are quite detailed. They all investigate the claim that Hamas used ambulances to ferry material, ammunition, weaponry, and militants. They all reached the same conclusion. There was no evidence whatsoever, even though Israel repeatedly targeted Palestinian ambulances. There's no evidence whatsoever that any of the ambulances were misused. And in fact, one of the interesting, among many interesting facts in the Goldstone report, the Israeli National, I have some friends here from Israel. Can you just raise your hand? Okay. Magen David, what's its official title? Ambulances, yeah, the ambulance service. They testified to Goldstone themselves. Magen David testified. I guess it's called Adam, A-D-O-M, Adam Magen David. Right. They testified there is no evidence whatsoever that those ambulances were misused by Hamas. As many of you know, Israel also targeted hospitals systematically in Gaza. It dropped white phosphorus on several of the hospitals. White phosphorus reaches a temperature of 800 degrees centigrade, 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. And they dropped white phosphorus in Al-Quds Hospital and the second hospital, and many of the hospitals were attacked. The grounds Israel gave was that the hospitals were being used as refuge for Hamas militants. That charge, too, was exhaustively investigated by all the human rights organizations, and all the human rights organizations reached the same conclusion. There's no evidence whatsoever that those hospitals were being misused by Hamas militants. I would also want to point out that the Israelis themselves presented next to no evidence to support their claims. So if you take, for example, the question of the ambulances, Israel put out a large report defending its actions in Gaza. And I read the report with considerable care. The only evidence they were able to present on the question of the ambulances is they quoted one ambulance driver as stating that Hamas attempted to commandeer his ambulance but was unsuccessful. And so by the Israeli admission, there was not a single case of an ambulance having been misused. On the question of the hospitals, the only evidence that Israel presented that the hospitals were misused, they claimed that one Palestinian detainee who they interrogated had acknowledged that there were Hamas officials in Shifa Hospital. But as Goldstone pointed out in his report, all of the Palestinian detainees were brutally tortured during the events in Gaza. Then there's the question of the targeting of the mosques in Gaza. Israel claimed the mosques were being used to store weapons. Israel only provided evidence, what it claims to be evidence, for December 31st and January 1st, where they said that there were secondary explosions in some of the mosques after they targeted them, which basically means that you drop some missile or bomb on the mosque, and then after it explodes, there are secondary explosions, which supposedly indicates that there were weapons hidden there. But after January 1st, Israel itself stopped making the claim that there were secondary explosions. So if you look at their press releases from January 2nd onwards, which I've read, they don't even pretend that there were weapons hidden in the mosques. And so far, no evidence has come forward. Israel also systematically targeted the minarets of the mosques in Gaza. And the minarets couldn't possibly have been a legitimate military target because they don't have staircases and they're too narrow for a person to scale. So they couldn't have been used as observation points. And the Dugard Commission, headed by the very smart and very decent South African jurist John Dugard, his commission concluded that the mosques, and more particularly the minarets, had been targeted on the grounds that they symbolized Islam. Now, a lot was said in defense of Israeli actions, and it continues to be said that Hamas used civilians as human shields. And all the human rights reports were very careful to investigate that charge. All the human rights reports came to the same conclusion. So Amnesty International found, contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. On the other hand, there was ample evidence, most exhaustively documented by the Goldstone report, that Israel used Palestinians, including Palestinian children, as human shields. All of the human rights reports concluded that Israel committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity. And they also conclude that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but in an incomparably smaller scale. And it should be obvious why it had to be on a smaller scale, because how many war crimes can an ant commit against a fellow with a magnifying glass? The Goldstone report was pretty tough in its conclusion. It said that what Israel did was a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. And that brings me now to the second half of my remarks, which will focus on what seems to be, at first glance, a perplexing question, namely, why of all this fuss over the Goldstone report? The Israelis were obviously very upset by that report. If you take the liberal end of the spectrum, say Michael Oren, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, who it's alleged in the U.S. that he's a historian, Michael Oren, he called the Goldstone report, he said it's worse than Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust deniers. Bear in mind that in Israel he's considered a sane voice. Then there's the Nobel laureate for peace, Shimon Peres. He called the Goldstone report a mockery of history. And he set out to set the historical record straight. And this is the historical record as Mr. Peres understands it. Quote, IDF, Israeli Army operations, are what brought economic prosperity in the West Bank, liberated Lebanon from the wrath of Hezbollah, and enabled Gaza residents to return to their daily routine. That's the Nobel laureate for peace. So the question arises, why the fuss over the Goldstone report? Because it was actually the last in a long series of reports on what happened in Gaza. Reports by very reputable organizations, both global organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and local organizations both in the occupied territories and in Israel. And if you look at the report itself, on some points it's a little bit weaker than the other human rights reports. For example, Goldstone does not categorically state that Israel's use of white phosphorus was a war crime, which was, I thought, a disappointment. On the other hand, there were aspects of the Goldstone report which are really quite impressive. First of all, contrary to I think most people think, a large part of the report was given over to attacking the whole occupation. It wasn't just devoted to Gaza. There were large sections which focused on not only the occupation, but also Israel's treatment of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which he calls discriminatory. And he even has two references, amazingly enough. There are two references in the report to the Palestinian right of return. But that's not, in my opinion, the main reason the report evoked such a hysteria in Israel. The main reason, it seems fairly clear, is who was the messenger. Mr. Goldstone, apart from being a renowned international jurist, he chaired significant investigations in South Africa and then was the chief prosecutor for the war crimes tribunals on Rwanda and Yugoslavia. But apart from his professional reputation, there is the personal aspect to Mr. Goldstone. Namely, he calls himself a Zionist. He supports Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in Palestine. He sits on the board of governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He received an honorary degree from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He says he's worked his entire adult life, has been devoted to work for Israel. His mother was an activist in the Zionist movement. His daughter made Aliyah to Israel. And so Goldstone was, as the Israeli columnist Gideon Levy put it, he was propaganda-proof, which is to say that for the past several decades, Israel has honed two main weapons in order to discredit and silence criticism of Israel. Number one, to claim that the critic is an anti-Semite, or in the case of a Jew, a self-hating Jew, or to claim that the critic is a Holocaust denier. But then comes along this fellow named Mr. Goldstone, and he just doesn't have the profile, or credibly, he doesn't have the profile of being an anti-Semite. He says he's a Zionist, and he says he loves Israel, and he doesn't seem to be a self-hating Jew. And he says that he began his whole career in international law because of the Nazi Holocaust, that was his main inspiration. So that doesn't sound like a Holocaust denier. And now Israel has a real problem on their hands. If he's not an anti-Semite, and he's not a self-hating Jew, and he's not a Holocaust denier, and he's not a dupe, and he's not a fool, then the only way to account for what he wrote in that report The only possible conclusion is he wrote what he wrote because it was true. And for Israel, that was a complete catastrophe, a disaster for them. And to this day, it's proven very difficult for them to undermine the credibility of his report. Because for the first time, really, Israel has been forced to confront the facts. They can't they can't character assassinate the messenger, and so now they're forced to look at the message. And it's very difficult to undermine the content of that message. The second significant aspect of the Goldstone report is that Goldstone himself is a kind of quintessential Jew. He's a liberal in his sensibilities. He's a lawyer by profession. He believes, as he says, in international law, international institutions, and so he's kind of your typical Jewish supporter of Israel, because Jews themselves are overwhelmingly liberal in their political inclinations. And you saw it very clearly in the results of the last election. It was 78% of Jews voted for Barack Obama. From the electorate as a whole, it was 53%. So Jews were 25 points greater than the electorate as a whole. Among whites, white electorate, it was 43% for Obama. And so Jews were 35 points higher than whites in general. Among Hispanics, it was 67% for Obama. So Jews were 11 points higher than Hispanics. And if you factor in socioeconomic status, then the Jewish vote is totally, so to speak, out of whack, with which one would expect. The only group, religious or ethnic, the only group that voted in greater numbers for Barack Obama were African Americans, where it was about 95%. Jews are overwhelmingly liberal. There's many kinds of evidence. I just read yesterday this horrific book by Norman Podhoretz, Why Are Jews Liberal? When you read Norman Podhoretz, the real question is, why is this man writing books? He's a complete imbecile. But he goes through all the data. He laments the data, of course, but the data is overwhelming on every single issue. Jews are to the very far extreme of the liberal spectrum. And that's an important fact, because liberalism, not only, but in significant part, it means belief in international institutions, belief in the rule of law, belief in human rights and human rights organizations. And it's now become completely untenable for somebody to call themselves liberal and to defend Israeli policy. And things took, to some extent, there was a quantitative or qualitative change in what happened in Gaza, because all of Israel's previous encounters with Arabs, they were always a mixture of military attack and attack on civilians. But they always had a military component. They were never the only component. In all the wars, Israel targeted significantly targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. But it was never only civilians and civilian infrastructure. Gaza was the first of Israel's encounters with its neighbors where it was just a massacre There was no military component to it. And for that reason, it was a kind of turning point. It's simply impossible any longer to defend Israeli policy and to call yourself a liberal. If you follow the actual coverage, there were only a handful of people who came out swinging in Israel's defense. That fellow from Harvard and a couple of others. But it was also very striking after what happened in Gaza that when the Goldstone report came out, even though no major newspaper came out supporting Goldstone against Israel, it's also a fact that no newspaper came out supporting Israel against Goldstone. There wasn't a single editorial in any major newspaper in the US which supported Israel against Goldstone. Many chose not to comment, but none would defend Israel against Goldstone for the same reason, that it's impossible any longer to reconcile liberal sensibilities with defense of Israeli policy. And the third major outcome of the Goldstone report, it's hard to say how long it's going to last, but for the first time in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, in a long time, the human rights issue has moved center stage, and it's at least now on a par with the so-called peace process, and even temporarily, I don't think it's going to last, but temporarily it displaced the peace process. The human rights issue displaced the peace process as the main focus of the conflict. And that was a very important development because that's where Israel is weakest. And if you look at the history, just to briefly go through it, on the history of the human rights issues, take for example the question of torture. If you open up now Israeli books, histories by Israelis, you take for example Benny Morris's book Righteous Victims, or Tom Segev's book on the 1967 war, they both say that they acknowledge Israel routinely tortured Palestinian detainees from right after June 1967. But for those of you in this room who go back a ways, you will remember that well into the 1980s, no human rights organization, let alone the media, would acknowledge Israel's use of torture. It was simply unsayable. I'm not sure if it was unthinkable, but it was unsayable. And that includes Amnesty International. Amnesty was very careful never to use the word torture when it came to Israel. In the 1980s, Amnesty had declared in the 1980s the decade to end torture, and it put out a famous book, was called Torture in the 80s. And when it came to Israel, they would not use the word torture. And the reasons were fairly obvious, and they go back to the point I made earlier, which is Jews are liberal, and Jews happen to be very wealthy. And you combine the two, and what you get is many of the human rights organizations are financed by liberal Jews. And the organizations were very careful and worried about the plug being pulled on them if they were too hard on Israel. Now things started to change with the first Intifada, and they changed basically for two reasons. Number one, the torture of Palestinian detainees became epidemic. All of the human rights organizations subsequently wrote that Israel's torture of Palestinian detainees was routine, methodical, and systematic. And the numbers were quite staggering. The estimates are between 20 and 30,000 Palestinian detainees were tortured between 1987 and 1993. So the problem had now reached epidemic proportions, and number two, for the first time, Israeli human rights organizations, most importantly B'Tselem, started to document Israeli use of torture. And so the main human rights organizations, Amnesty, and now, in addition to Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, they had a moral cover. They can always say, as they did, well, B'Tselem is saying this. And so they began to document Israel's human rights abuses, and not just torture, but a large number, the house demolitions, the curfews, and so on and so forth. The problem was, this began roughly in 1990. The problem was they produced, in many cases, excellent reports, irrefutable, very impressive research, but nobody read them. They just collected dust. And the media would continue to report, well, Palestinians say this, Israelis say that, who knows what the truth is? But of course there was another source they could have gone to. They could have gone to the human rights organizations. That was all scrupulously ignored and avoided. Well, what happened with the Goldstone report is, for the first time, and we don't know yet how long it'll last, but for the first time, the human rights reporting on Israel and Palestine has become politically consequential. It now has real repercussions and real consequences. And so it was not surprising that as the human rights issue finally, at last, became a real political issue, then Israel and its supporters began to pull all the stoppers to discredit these organizations. So now there are a large number of organizations devoted to one goal, and that's to discredit the findings of these human rights organizations. They're focused in particular on Human Rights Watch because it's the most influential, but it's also the weakest and the most vulnerable on the question of Israel and Palestine, because it's most susceptible to the financial and the social pressures of the so-called supporters of Israel. So as many of you know, a few weeks ago, a very prominent member of Human Rights Watch, Robert Bernstein, he wrote an op-ed in the Times attacking Human Rights Watch, even though he was a member of Human Rights Watch. Then Elie Wiesel and Alan Dershowitz began this jihad against Human Rights Watch, and all for the same reason, because they recognize now that the human rights findings and organizations can no longer be ignored. Now, as I said, it's hard to gauge how long this will last, because already you see a shift occurring and we're back to that fatuous peace process, and the claim, the talk about will the Palestinians declare a state and all of this nonsense, which I think is regrettable. I think it would, not that those people over there think, but it would have made much more sense to focus on the human rights issue than in the peace process. Well, the last thing is, what does it all mean for us? What are the political implications for all of us? And my own view is that the Goldstone Report is an excellent platform to pursue our work, but it requires two things. Number one, I think the Goldstone Report, again, testifies to the fact that we have to focus on a political agenda on which a consensus exists. The agenda that Goldstone sets out in his report, and which has been set out by the International Court of Justice, and the agenda that's been set out by the United Nations General Assembly and other institutions. The agenda of human rights, the agenda of ending the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. That I think we have to focus on that agenda because it's where Israel is weakest and where the prospects for achieving something are strongest. And that we should, in my opinion, do our best to free ourselves of slogans, of idle dreams, and also of ideological litmus tests. A large number of people seem to think that whether or not person X or person Y is a Zionist, or an anti-Zionist, or a non-Zionist, or a post-Zionist, that this is somehow an important litmus test to pass. And I think one of the lessons to be learned from the Goldstone report is that it's just totally irrelevant. If you were to ask me now what I wish would happen, if the Palestinians were smart and they had the capacity now, they would take the Goldstone report, they would ask the General Assembly to refer it to the International Court of Justice. Now, the Goldstone report said that the blockade of Gaza is a possible crime against humanity. If they referred it to the ICJ, it's inconceivable that the ICJ would come back with any other opinion except that the blockade is illegal. And then the Palestinians would have two huge victories. They would have the illegality of the wall in the West Bank and the illegality of the blockade in Gaza. And that would be the foundation for a massive movement of civil disobedience, which would join the West Bank and Gaza. A movement in the West Bank to dismantle the wall, and a movement in Gaza to break the blockade. And between them, with the backing of the ICJ, and they would have to get the backing of the EU on both of those counts, I think Israel would be very isolated, and those would be achievable goals.